All right, I think we're good to go. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this incredibly exciting panel hosted by the Middle East Institute's Lebanon program. My name is Chris Abi Nassif, and I'm the program director as well as the moderator for today's discussion. So before we begin, and if you haven't had the chance yet, I would really like to invite you to check out the urgent Lebanon-focused policy brief that the Middle East Institute has put together and published yesterday in collaboration with the American Task Force on Lebanon, ATFL, as well as the Lebanese International Finance Executives, or LIFE. This brief outlines recommendations to the Biden administration for immediate and short-term steps to bring Lebanon back from the abyss. So if you attended yesterday's programming, you must be already familiar with this timely brief, and we thank you for your genuine interest in the Lebanese question. But if you didn't and you're interested in learning some more, our events team will shortly share a link to this 4-page brief in the chat. So moving back to today, our distinguished panel will be zooming in on Lebanon's painful and ongoing financial meltdown to discuss where the country stands today, how it got there, and probably most importantly, how and even if it can move forward. So we'll briefly ground our conversation in what's happening today to bring everyone to the same page. We'll then leverage our panelists' incredible frontline experience, since most of them have lived through this in real time, and expert analysis to better understand how and why this meltdown has come to be and how the buildup towards it has shaped its scale and its magnitude. And then we'll finally spend the better portion of the conversation really on what can be done on the fiscal, on the monetary, and on the social fronts to shield as best as possible the people of Lebanon in the weeks and the months ahead. So hopefully we'll be able to take that in depth as we go. So first of all, on the panelist front, I would like to introduce Alain Bifani. Alain is a Lebanese economist and a finance specialist who served until very recently as the Director General of the Lebanese Ministry of Finance. He served in that capacity from 2000 to 2020. In his capacity, Alain prepared the Lebanese government's plan to exit the crisis and is behind the forensic audit request that I'm sure is going to come to be discussed in that conversation. Next, I'm really pleased to introduce Nasir Sahidi. Nasir is the founder and the president of Nasir Sahidi and Associates. He previously served as the Lebanese Minister of Economy and Trade and the Minister of Industry between 1998 and 2000. He was also the first vice governor of the Central Bank of Lebanon, BDL, for 2 successive mandates, 1993 to 98, and then 98 to 2003. So he has plenty of experience on both of these fronts, and we'll be discussing a lot of that as well. Nasir is also a non-resident expert at MEI's Lebanon program. So thanks for that, Nasir. And then finally, we're really happy to be joined by Haneen Al-Sayed. Haneen is the lead social protection and job specialist for the Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank. And then since the onset of the economic and the financial crisis in Lebanon, Haneen has been leading the World Bank's social response to the crisis, including a large-scale emergency social safety net project, which will also touch upon in today's conversation. So on the logistics front, and to submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can probably see at the bottom of your screens. And for those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu, and our team will channel that to the panelists. And if you have any technical issues as well throughout this hour and a half that we have together, please email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking at all of your questions and we'll factor in as many as possible into the discussion. Before we begin, I also want to apologize on behalf of Henry Shaul, who unfortunately will not be able to join us on today's panel. So he sends his apologies and he'll be with us on subsequent panels, hopefully. And with that, let us dive right in. This is going to be more of a discussion format rather than an opening remarks, etc. format to allow for as much conversation as possible. So we'll dive right in with a question to you, Nasir, to kind of set the stage for today's conversation. What on earth is happening on the macroeconomic front in Lebanon's economy today?
Right. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the MEI for organizing this event. As you rightly put it, Lebanon is in the abyss, and the question is, how do we eventually get it out of the abyss? So let me first really paint the macroeconomic picture of where we are. Some of this might be familiar to the people listening in, but it's good to remind us where we are. And let me preface this by saying this is for adults only. So if there are any children in the room, please remove them. To begin with, you need to talk about what's happening in terms of the economy and real activity. So this is the fourth consecutive year that real GDP in Lebanon has been in decline. Last year by a massive 26% and probably another 5% this year over and above what happened last year. So in effect, even if you look at just total income, it's being cut by a half, you know, massive decline. So people who talk about the Great Depression, well, this is double the Great Depression, just to put that in perspective. At the same time, you've got inflation. And inflation last year was in excess of 140%. Food inflation in excess of 400%. And people need to remember that a lot of the food as well as the other essentials are imported. And therefore, this also reflects another aspect, which is the exchange rate depreciation, which I will get to in a minute. Now, behind all this, and I'll come back to it, are two twin deficits, the budget deficit and the current account deficit. Lebanon has been in unsustainable fiscal deficits for several decades already, as well as current account deficits. So just to give the numbers so that put things in perspective, for 2019, we're talking about a 13.5% current account deficit, another 11.5% in 2020, and declining in 2021 because of a large decline in income. On the fiscal side, very large fiscal deficits, 12%, 9.6%, but declining again. We'll get to that, and I'm sure Alain will comment on it, largely because government is no longer paying interest on the debt. But the real headline for many people is, of course, what happened to the exchange rate. People will recall that the exchange rate was fixed for, in fact, several decades now, since 93, 94, and now it has collapsed. So just to put that in perspective, it was fixed and pegged at 1507. By 2019, if you look at the black market rate, the average was 1620. It ended the year at 2090. And then in 2020, it collapsed. So we jumped to an average 5,500, and end of the year last year, 8,300. But now we're running at 15,000. 15,000. So that's a 90% collapse of the exchange rate. So just keep that in mind, because of course you're importing something like 80% of the goods that you're consuming. And when the exchange rate collapses, that it automatically translates into a higher cost of living, and in particular the food inflation that we mentioned. Now, when income collapses, what also happens is that people get thrown out of jobs. There are bankruptcies, and that's what we are living. So the unemployment rate, as best as we can measure it, on average, is over 30% of the population. 30% of the population. So this is worse than what you've heard about Greece and other countries that went into financial crises and collapses. And of course, as a result of all this, the decline in income, you've got poverty rates going through the roof. 55% of the Lebanese population is estimated now to be poor, and 25% is living extreme poverty. This is food poverty. They can barely provide food for themselves and their families. And underlying all this, we need to start discussing now why we got here and how we got here. Just one final item, just to understand the implications of inflation and how we got here. If you look at currency in circulation, just to give you those numbers because they're shocking numbers, at the end of 2019, you had 9,817 billion Lebanese pounds in circulation. So this is currency in circulation, yeah? By January 2021, it was 30,710 billion, yeah? So 30 trillion, so tripled in the space of 2 years, yeah? So when you ask what is the origin of inflation, there you have it. It's a large increase in the money supply. So why did we get here and how did we get here? I think you need to look at two sets of factors. There are domestic factors, but there are also external factors in the region, which also hurt Lebanon. But if you start of how did we get here, we have to start with the unsustainable budget deficits and the current account deficits. The budget deficits meant that you increasingly increased the debt, so a large buildup of debt. So by 2020 and 2019, you had debt levels that exceeded 170%, and then in 2020 even increased even more because income collapsed. The level of debt stayed where it was. So second or third highest debt levels in the world. And at the same time, you had the large current account deficits, which means we were borrowing from the rest of the world, right, to keep up our consumption levels. And that resulted in part from an overvalued exchange rate. Remember that the peg, as we said, it was continued pegging from the 1990s. And we pegged to the US dollar. So at the time, for example, when the US dollar was increasingly overvalued, so was Lebanon. And what that meant is that you made your exports less competitive, including things like tourism. But at the same time, when you have an overvalued exchange rates, you tend to suck in imports, right? So your trade balance tends to deteriorate and you have to end up financing it. And the financing happened coming from inflows from the Lebanese diaspora. Lebanon is blessed, of course, with having a large population, which is highly educated, but was also emigrated. So much of our human capital is abroad, and they remain attached to their families and their home country. And therefore, they continued remitting on a continuing basis. And this helped finance the balance of payments and trade account deficits. But these deposits which came in and these remittances went into the banking system. And government, through the central bank, started borrowing increasingly from the domestic banking system. And so what emerged was the interlinking of three balance sheets. The government's balance sheet with a high level of debt, and then the central bank helping finance budget deficits and monetizing the debt by borrowing from the domestic banking system. And then the domestic banking system sucking in remittances and deposits from mainly Lebanese from the rest of the world. How was this achieved? Increasingly by paying higher and higher interest rates. And eventually what emerged starting in 2016 with the bailout of the banks by the central bank, and that was massive. What we're talking about is more than $5.3 billion bailout of the banks, which doesn't sound like a big number, but you have to put it in perspective. As a percentage of GDP, that was around 12.5% of GDP. No country in the world, not the US, not the EU, or anybody else, did that massive bailout of the banks. And this, of course, was not authorized. It was not voted in parliament. It was not voted by government. It was an action by the central bank. But it also meant a large buildup of debt. And then continuing from there, higher and higher interest rates simply to protect the overvalued pound. And eventually, you entered into a Ponzi scheme. The central bank entered into a Ponzi scheme whereby it was borrowing simply to be able to pay the interest on the debt that it had accumulated. And eventually, end of 2019, confidence was broken. The Ponzi scheme burst. And this is what we've been observing since November 2019 and into 2020. that Ponzi scheme has meant that payments have been stopped. There are informal capital controls. There are restrictions on payments, restrictions on how much you can withdraw from your deposits at the central, and in your banks. There are now effectively credit controls. And the result of the informal capital controls, the payment restrictions, the credit controls means a big liquidity squeeze on the private sector. So the private sector no longer has credit, no longer has access to its collateral, which is deposits and others at the banks. And as a result of that, you get this failure of economic activity, bankruptcies, and greater unemployment. So the interconnected balance sheets is a critical bit, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to resolve this. The banks are holding government debt and central bank debt. The central bank is holding government debt because it financed budget deficits, and it shouldn't have been financing. The law says you should not finance government, but it did. And then all of ourselves as depositors have our money at the banks. And the banks are saying, well, we lent it to the central bank. And the central bank is saying, well, I lent it to government. So how do you resolve that issue is the major issue moving forward, because it means that there's going to have to be some burden sharing. Government cannot repay the debt and doesn't have the assets, because the borrowing, as we said, did not go to build assets. It went to build to finance overspending. And so the big issue as we move forward is, how do we resolve that? Who's going to bear the burden? So far, the burden has been on depositors and on the general population through the inflation tax, through the high inflation, and increased lirification, what we call lirification of deposits. You can no longer access, you can only get Lebanese pounds, you cannot get dollars. So, big question as you move forward, how do we get to this burden sharing? How do you get accountability? Because at the end of the day, this is a big failure of governance. Nearly all financial crises, all banking crises are at the bottom and at the end of it, failures of governance. So moving forward, how are you going to get this accountability? And how do you get a resolution for this burden sharing? So let me stop there.
Perfect, Nasir. Thank you for setting the stage and for kind of painting this interconnected picture in a way which is very useful to ground the conversation. Haneen, I wanted to go to you next, and I'll do so in a second, because Nasir touched upon this failures of governance notion, and I think that's the perfect, in a way, leeway to bring Alain to the conversation. Having served, Alain, as one of the top civil servants in Lebanon for 20 years, you've in a way seen the belly of this beast. And you've seen how it developed. And I think you're the most fit to comment on these failures of governance over the years, from how you've seen it from your role as a former Director General in the Ministry of Finance, one of the key ministries in Lebanon, especially at this stage. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well on how all this developed over the past 20 years, and particularly on this governance piece from the inside, as someone who saw it develop on the inside.
Thank you, Chris. I don't have much to add, of course, to what Nasir said. I mean, the expose was extremely clear, I think, but maybe some perspective from the political angle, which also led to this catastrophic governance that we are suffering from. We were coming out of a war that was the beginning of the 90s. And there was an obvious question. How could we please the militiamen who were in the streets? And how could we cover the occupation expenses? And this had to be part of the settlement that we witnessed at that point in time. Of course, the solution that was taken was to use illegally diverted public funds, as easy as that. And there was a major item, and that was to establish the legitimacy of the new leadership. By doing what? By pleasing the population on one hand, and by satisfying the clans and militias and invaders on the other side. On the first point, which is, pleasing the population, what did we see? We saw governments very happy to decline revenues, to make sure that the revenues would drop, to decrease tax rates. Governments that were increasing all kinds of expenditures, because from those expenditures, they would obviously extract the part I was referring to that would be diverted to satisfy the clans. We were running, as Nasir just said, a very high fiscal deficit. And of course, the use of interest rates was not only because we wanted to attract money. It started at the beginning of the 90s in the Lebanese pound, on the Lebanese pound. And it was openly insider trading operations. I mean, when we saw the interest rates rocket to 40% roughly, that wasn't only political pressure, it was political pressure, but it was also one of the biggest insider trading operations we've seen. And of course, there was another purpose, and that was to create the illusion of wealth. And this led to the increase of public debt already at the beginning of the 90s. We have to add to that the use of real estate speculation. And what happened here is that those who had some money at the bank felt that all of a sudden they were wealthy people because they were getting an enormous amount of interest. Those who had a small plot of land felt rich because the land was becoming extremely expensive. So all of that led, as Nasir explained, to a high fiscal deficit, but also to a drop in productivity because of the rates and because of real estate prices, and to, therefore, an increase in the current account deficit. And obviously, having those two issues happening at the same time was already, if you want, the stage for what was going to happen later. But on the second point, pleasing the clans and pleasing the ex-militias, we saw corruption, we saw a lot of political spending, and all of that was taken from the public money. This is a period of time that I didn't see. I joined the ministry in 2000. I'm talking about the 1990s. But this period of time was a period of, excuse the word, big theft. And one may ask, why didn't we see any counterpowers? Why didn't we see any parliament opposing this, judiciary, etc.? And this is, to answer your question, the beginning of the end of decent governance. Parliament was not controlling nor penalizing simply because the clans were represented at parliament. And those were the very people who were benefiting from these policies. So it became totally unthinkable to see a parliament object to what governments were doing. And by the way, we haven't seen one single government fall under parliamentarian pressure since the beginning of the Second Republic. So first control, the popular control, was off. The second kind of control is obviously the judiciary one. Well, the destruction of the judiciary body on top of the control bodies and the public administration as a whole was absolutely terrible. Let's not forget that the vacancies in the public administration and the judiciary bodies were so huge that it was practically impossible for any of them to perform their duties. And I can tell you, when I was rebuilding my own administration, how terrible it was to do it against all odds, because the political system didn't want any administration to be rebuilt. I would only refer to one item, which is salaries. Let's keep in mind that salaries were frozen from the end of the war until 2017, practically, in order to transform civil servants into either beggars or thieves. And by the way, during this period of time, what we saw was the integration of thousands of militiamen in the state apparatus. And this integration, well, in some countries, people would expect that within a few years' time, these people would adapt and be integrated in the system. But when on top of having these people flood into the administration, you have their own bosses who become ministers, well, those who will have to adapt are the civil servants, not the ex-militiamen. And basically, we saw, slowly but surely, most of the state administrations, public administrations, and also state-owned enterprises transform into militia-owned entities within the state. And on top of that, we were witnessing the use of debt instruments to distribute wealth. And then on the real economy, as if it wasn't enough, the clan started to introduce middlemen who would be their own representatives in the economy, basically taking more than 95% of anything that was to be done in terms of projects, contracting, procurement, whatever. And this, of course, was a terrible competition for the normal companies that Lebanon had. And you have to add to the illegal competition that I just referred to, the fact that you have on the market companies that are competing with normal ones, but not paying social security, invading plots of lands instead of buying or renting them, not paying taxes, not paying electricity, telecom, and so on. So you can imagine how difficult it is for normal companies to, if you want, compete with this. And we are witnessing a very aggressive evolution, whereby those who don't abide to law are the ones who survive. But this has also yet another impact, and that is the fall of competitiveness when it comes to Lebanese companies being able to perform globally. And obviously, at the same time, we saw the maintain of the peg at any cost. And of course, with the double deficit rising, it was a big question mark. I mean, why do we have to do that? Again, the illusion of wealth, but also building personal agendas, because the heroes of the peg basically ruled Lebanon for a very long time. And we ended up having this double impact of maintaining the peg and the huge current account deficit that was putting permanent pressure on the system. And we had to attract dollars all the time at any cost. But suddenly in 2011, we saw many things happen at the same time. The oil prices dropped, and well, you may know that there is a very high correlation between remittances and oil prices in the case of Lebanon. There was the start of the war in Syria with the impact on trade, with the impact on the internal situation, refugees. There was a shift in the Arab investments toward weaponry. And we also saw the Gulf countries basically withdrawing from Lebanon due to their relationship or their conflicting relation with Hezbollah. All of this led to lower flows. And as Nasir said, in 2016, we were already seeing the end of the game. And effectively, those financial engineerings that started at the end of 2015 were supposed to compensate for all of this. But again, that was not only not well thought, it was illegal. It wasn't covered by anything. It wasn't approved by anybody, not even by the Central Council of the Central Bank. Those were performed by the governor of the Central Bank. And we saw people making fortunes simply because they are supposedly the ones who are bringing into the system fresh dollars. And we're not even sure that all of them brought fresh dollars, basically. But had default happened in 2016, which would have been logical, we would have saved billions of dollars for the recovery period. And we would have saved that for the whole population in this situation. Now, I don't know if you want to move to Haneen, or if I can say a few words on what happened exactly and how the situation, or if you want, how the plan was sabotaged and torpedoed.
Yeah. Yeah, let me move to Haneen actually. Thank you, Alain, for this. And I think it's useful again to better understand all this context. I know we tend to focus immediately on the last 1 year, but this has been in the making for the past 3 decades. And it's good to be able to cover that with you and Nasir. Haneen, we've talked about the macro and monetary piece. We've talked about the governance piece, but obviously all the people who are really suffering from all of that are the everyday citizens of Lebanon. Nasir mentioned the 55% poverty rate. Very likely to increase as well, 25% extreme poverty rate. So from your work, and you've been on the ground and you've been leading the efforts on the social protection front. So I'm curious if you can also, share with us your thoughts on where the situation is right now and where can it eventually lead, absent any potential reforms or any potential actions on behalf of the central government.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. So I actually very much pick up where Nasir mentioned governance, and Alain described it in the public sector very well. And essentially the social sectors, whether it be health or education or social protection, are all embodiment of those kind of dysfunctionalities and weak governance or bad governance that existed for years in these sectors, and which bring us to where we are today. I mean, Lebanon coming into the crisis in October 2019, or whenever you want to define it, had huge vulnerabilities in the population already. Take, for example, the fact that already there was very high dropout rates from education, from school, especially on the public sector. You had among the very poor population, almost 50% of them do not make it to completing by the age of 18, are already out of school. Take health. People spend a lot of out-of-pocket money on health, which obviously for poor people, this was a burden before the crisis and has become increasingly so. Take social safety nets. Lebanon used to spend about, or still does, 0.35 or 0.4% of GDP on social safety nets. I'm not talking about subsidies, which can be considered a type of safety net, but let's talk about targeted safety nets. Very, very little compared to, countries at this income level at least spend 1% of GDP. So, and even spending on health and education from the public sector wasn't very high compared to a lot more was on the people spend on that. So, but what this meant was that high inequality in the system. So if you could afford to pay to go to the schools, access to good health services that did exist in the country, you were fine. But obviously that was not the case for many. And in terms of development and how countries develop, we care about the inequities that are in the system. So the social system or sectors in Lebanon really embody this the inequity that exists elsewhere in the system that is being described at the macro level, but is filtered down to the micro level as well. And certainly the weak institutional structure in the public sector impacted service delivery very much. So coming into the crisis, we've seen that poverty rates have gone up very dramatically. Poverty in Lebanon has been kind of hovering for the last 10 years around the extreme poverty, the food poverty around 20%, and the upper poverty around 20%, let's say 10% and 20%. But what we see is that come 2019, this has really shot up. Essentially, both of those figures doubled. And Nasir has mentioned some of the figures. Of course, I do want to caveat that all of these numbers on poverty, including the ones that the World Bank holds or that we have estimated, are not based on recent surveys, because this is another big issue we have in Lebanon, is the lack of data to really provide evidence-based policy, which policy can be made. So it's using old data and trying to analyze it going forward. Now, let me say the figures that we have put out in terms of lower poverty, 22% of the population under food poverty and 45% under the upper poverty. I'll tell you a little secret. Those, although it is a footnote in our report, those are based as of March 2020 projections of inflation and GDP growth. And what were they then? Inflation was projected at that time 20%, and you heard the numbers what they are now. And GDP growth was like, again, like minus 10%. And we also heard what the numbers will actually, numbers are for 2020. So I'm not even gonna attempt to sort of say what it is now, but you can get the message that the poverty is probably much, much higher than these numbers that are being quoted. But short of having a new kind of household budget survey, we don't, you know, we are working in that realm. A very important part of that is the food insecurity. Again, you know, mentioned that inflation for food has gone up to more than 400%. And given that the poor, essentially almost 40%, if not more than their consumption is food. So you can understand who is being hit very, very strongly by this. So take back to the education, just to give you a bit more granularity about how what we're seeing is happening. So with the kind of loss of income that families are experiencing, many are trying to shift their children from private schools to public schools. The Ministry of Education estimates that something like 54,000 children have moved from private schools to public schools. The public sector already, which is overstretched because it's hosting a very large number of Syrian refugees, and already itself was suffering from many institutional weaknesses that have been built over the years. So this is, we would only expect that things could continue to deteriorate. Now, COVID, of course, has also been a very negative impact. We estimate that for 2020 academic year, something like 75% of the school days were closed. And then, you know, the online learning, we know that can only be effective if you are equipped with the right IT and internet infrastructure, which something like 60% of the students in schools in Lebanon from surveys do not have even laptops or have to share. So you can just imagine that there's, you know, years of learning that are also being lost. Lebanon, let me also say, came in already with low outcomes in terms of overall human capital. The World Bank's Human Capital Index measures Lebanon in terms of its health and education outcomes, that if a child is born today, when he or she reaches the age of 18, given the education and health system that is today in Lebanon, they will only reach about 50% of their productivity. So that's a very large cost to the economy as well in the long run. The job market, of course, is also equally difficult. From, again, some kind of quick phone surveys, we learned that about a fifth of firms have closed permanently. From the Beirut blast alone, something like 10,000 micro and SMEs were damaged. That's just from the Beirut blast. And of course, very high job losses for workers. Coming then to the final sort of, if I may, on the social side, I mentioned that spending and sort of on health, education, some of these basic social and human development parameters have been very low and, well, relatively low, but people have to spend a lot of out of pocket. But there's one anomaly in Lebanon, which is spending on public pensions. And this comes to, it's a fiscal story, very important for the fiscal side. For its public sectors, i.e. civil and military, Lebanon spends a lot on, it has a very lucrative pension scheme for this group of population, something that contributes to about 3.5% of GDP annually, compared to, while it's only reaching about 10% of the population, the civil and military, compared to the rest of the population, which does not even have really a pension system. All it has is the end of service indemnity. If you happen to be lucky in the formal sector covered by National Social Security, otherwise you really have nothing. So vulnerability is very high, inequity is extremely high. They were such coming into the system and coming into the crises, and now are simply being exasperated day by day. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Haneen. And I think it's useful, going back to you, Nasir, to potentially just trying to look at solutions and trying to think through what may come next. We've seen this collapse in the currency that you described at the beginning, slowly and then accelerating over the past few months, starting last summer, really. So in a situation such as these, how do you stabilize a currency that is in free fall? If you were to look ahead and, we were having conversations months ago about how do you stabilize the currency, and yet nothing's happened so far. So what is the way forward on the currency stabilization front to be able to start rebuilding this potential trust in the Lebanese system and economy?
Well, I think if I just want to summarize where we are, because I think that's important to where we might be heading. I think we mentioned state capture, of SOEs, government-related enterprises, and government itself by the militias and the various parties. Extremely important, because that is the main source of corruption, waste, and bribery, right? Which added to the deficit and everything else. So when we think of moving forward, that's going to be has to be an essential plank. Second, I think, is this issue of inequality and growing inequality that Haneen was referring to and Alain was referring to. Basically, the financial engineering schemes and the high level of interest rates increased inequality in Lebanon, okay? And so a very small class of the rich benefited from this at the expense of everybody else. So I think that's important when we want to think of where do we move forward. So when you think about the currency collapse, the only way you can start thinking of controlling it is you start off by restoring trust and confidence. Trust and confidence in the banking system has been destroyed because of the absence of capital controls, because of the various restrictions. So what you need is a multiple reform package. So I'll mention the headings very quickly. We might want to do it under later, but let me mention the large headings first, and then we can get on to the discussion. It's going to be a list of things, but I think they're important. If you want to restore trust and combat corruption, you have to start with an audit, a fiscal, an audit of the central bank, of the BDL, right? To understand a forensic audit. You need an independent judiciary, which we don't have at the moment. And we've seen that in the case of the Beirut port explosion, the assassination of Luqman, Slim, etc. You need to abolish banking secrecy. That's part of the issue, because every time you start talking about combating corruption, you hit the wall of banking secrecy. And you need to start a stolen asset recovery program, just in order to start restoring confidence. Because if you don't have the restoration of confidence, you're not going to be able to have a currency which is sustainable over time. Number two, you've got to move on fiscal reform, deep fiscal reform, in order to have a sustainable path for debt and start reducing the debt to GDP level over time. Number three, we mentioned the interlinked balance sheets. So that means you got to restructure the banking and financial sector. That means a recapitalization of the banks and a merger and consolidation of the large number of banks that we have, because in effect, they have lost all their equity. And nobody's going to invest back into them or even want their deposits in an illiquid and insolvent banking system. So you can't do anything on monetary policy without addressing that, okay? Number four, you got to restructure the public debt as well as BDL debt. Remember that the central bank borrowed. It's not just public debt. The central bank itself borrowed, and then there's public debt. That has to be restructured because neither the central bank nor the public sector can repay the debt. So that has to be restructured. Now, much of it is Lebanese pound debt, and the bulk of it is owned by Lebanese. In a funny way, that is very unfortunate. Had we owed it to the rest of the world, we might have gone and negotiated it down and restructured it, because the risk would have been on everybody else. Unfortunately, because of the policies of the government, but particularly of the central bank, we shifted the risk of borrowing onto the Lebanese depositor and onto the Lebanese population. So we are bearing the cost of adjustment ourselves as Lebanese. And the inflation tax I mentioned earlier is a deliberate policy by the government, the caretaker government and the central bank, to have an internal solution instead of finding an external solution, which we'll come back to. Now, let's turn to monetary policy, because that's the essence of your question. If I want to have a credible and sustainable monetary policy, I need those other reforms. I need to start those reforms, otherwise it won't be complete. So on the monetary policy side, let me mention these and then we can discuss. First is that you need a Capital Controls Act. At the moment, there are informal controls. Nobody knows how much outflows there are. And we know, however, who benefits from that. It's the people who are connected, right? Who have access to the banks. And typically, they are shareholders in the banks. They are politicians who sit on the boards of the banks, and they own the banks. So until you have a Capital Controls Act in place, you're not going to restore confidence and restore capital flows back into the system and remittances. Nobody wants to remit in Lebanon, because if they remit back to Lebanon, they fear that the deposit will be frozen again. You will need to unify the exchange rate. At the moment, you have multiple exchange rates. You have an official rate, which is a figment of the imagination. Then you have a bank rate, and then you have a black market rate, and several other maybe in between. You're going to have to unify them, but you can only do that within an overall package, and if you get some international financing to support the balance of payments. You're going to need a currency reform, i.e., right from now, if we're going to move forward, I think we need to have a withdrawal of the current currency, because people have lost confidence in it, and you need to chop off at least 3 zeros. So a currency reform within an overall package. But you also need to address the main issue, namely the governance of the central bank. When we talk about the large budget deficits and how they got financed, that includes also quasi-fiscal deficits and their financing by the central bank. Alain knows this very well, and I'm sure he'll want to comment on it. The quasi-fiscal deficits include all sorts of programs to help various sectors. Real estate was one of them, many other sectors as well. So that has to stop. It is not the business of a central bank to do quasi or fiscal operations. You have to stop quasi-fiscal deficits. It also means you have to stop any lending to government. The Money and Credit Code effectively stipulates that thou shalt not lend to government except in extraordinary circumstances. And if you are going to lend, you can lend up to 10% of the average revenues of the previous 3 years, and that for 1 year or less. This was flouted. So in any reform moving forward, you have to stop any lending to government. That has to be changed radically. Then you've got to amend your Money and Credit Code. You need a new monetary law in place. And in particular, you're going to need to insist on public disclosure and accountability. The central bank, until now, does not disclose its accounts and its profit and loss. This is incredible. The central bank does not seem to hold itself accountable to parliament, to government, or anybody else. So under the pretense of independence of the central bank, there's no accountability or responsibility being taken. That needs to change. So there has to be public disclosure. And you need an independent banking control commission. The fact that the Banking Control Commission is within the central bank and the central bank pays its budget and all the rest means that it is not really independent. It is another instrument which is used for control. And you need to change the terms of the governorship. You should only be maximum be able to have one more term, not a multiple of 4 or 5 terms. Once you have multiple terms, you become totally not only independent, but you become governing on your own and independent and unaccountable. That has to change. We have to stop that immediately. And you have to stop multiple accumulation of functions. So for example, at the moment, the governor is also the head of the Capital Market Authority, but also the head of the Financial Control Commission, right? The Anti-Money Laundering Commission. So you've got accumulation of those functions, which should not be allowed for good governance. Then the next step is structural reforms, subsidies, particular EDL. Hanin and the World Bank know quite a bit about electricity reform and energy sector reform. Subsidized rates for electricity, a lot of corruption in the provision of fuel to the electricity de Liban, and also in the purchases of fuel by Lebanon. So just to give an example, last year, Lebanon imported 3 times its annual consumption. 3 times its annual consumption. Where did the other 2/3 go? Well, they went across the border. Why did they go across the border? Because fuel and other in Syria is twice as expensive as Lebanon, and Syria is under sanctions. So what have we been doing? We've been subsidizing Syria and sending our fuel over to Syria at the expense of our international reserves. So the whole issue of the energy sector and EDL and its great inefficiency needs to be resolved. The SOEs, your state-owned enterprises and government-related enterprises, have got to be reformed. They're a major source of corruption. As Alain was pointing out a bit earlier, the politicians stuffed the SOEs and the government-related enterprises with their own people, enormous salaries being paid, lots of people being employed. Just look at the telecom sector, right? It's supposed to be one of the biggest earners and usually one of the biggest earners for all governments across the world. Its contribution to government revenues has been declining at a rate of 15 to 20% every year. So now we're going to end up having subsidizing the telecom sector if this continues. And finally, I mean, Hanin was mentioning the pension system. It is outlandish and goes only to help a small minority. That will have to be part of reform. The 7th item, I think, on my agenda would be what Hanin was mentioning, a social safety net. The vast majority of Lebanese simply don't have any safety net. If they go unemployed, they have nothing to fall back on. And now they're increasingly going to be faced with poverty and eventually famine. That's what we're looking forward to.
Thank you.
And so, of all that, that's what's going to be required if you want to restore confidence in the currency.
Thank you, Nasir. Very elaborate and long response, but pretty comprehensive and detailed and very clear, I think. Alain, I want to go to you, and at some point I'm going to go to you as well, Hanin, to discuss more on this social programming front as immediate next steps. But before we do that, Alain, I wanted to hear your comments, but I also wanted to relay a lot of the questions that came up in the chat as Nasir was speaking. Well, it seems that Nasir has been using a lot of passive voice, right? Passive tense about what needs to be done, etc. Alain, from your perspective from inside government and knowing how these things work, first of all, is this clear? Do people in charge know about all of these reforms that Nasir has mentioned? And second of all, how do you force or how do you make them enforce some of, or if not all of these comprehensive reform packages effectively, which has been the conversation over the past 18 months in the country. That's why the IMF negotiations came to a stand earlier last year. That's why, the status quo continues, etc. So how do you make these reforms happen? And I know that it's not very straightforward.
Well, it's not straightforward, but it's not so difficult to imagine, Chris. Of course, the question of what to do has to be immediately followed by how to do it practically. And I can imagine how people struggle to understand how the system works. For instance, I have a question in front of me saying, why didn't you expose this when you were there? And the simple answer is that I did it every single day. You know, it's like, are you kidding me? This is the reason why this system hates me so much. And I was doing that at Parliament. I was doing that in press conferences. I don't know if you've heard of a lot of director generals holding press conferences on corruption. But basically, all of this is happening in the system. And of course, people don't see that. They don't see the struggle from within. What I want to say here is that obviously, when we are today at the point of redoing the math, if we want to engage in an exercise like that, and we are, well, we don't go far, because the situation has become so bad that redoing the math all the time will not do. What matters now is to imagine a way of moving forward along the lines that Nasir has just very well described. And I would like here to suggest one way of doing that before elaborating a little bit on the measures. So one way of doing that, what could it be? Of course, we have to keep in mind here that, as Nasir said, capital controls are of essence. Although there's not much left, and even a bail-in today seems to fall far behind whatever we need. There is a need for bank resolution framework immediately, a need to sort out the currency rates, find social safety nets, etc. Now, how do we do that? I would put it in 3 points, actually. The first point would be to politically neutralize this standstill, this frozen situation in which we are, and that relates to the so-called US-Iranian negotiations. One has to put Lebanon outside this for a while. We are seeing now in Yemen some indirect talks between the USA and the Iranians to, try to move on. And something that would be extremely useful is to have a tiny mini discussion on the side, away from the big picture between the two countries, on one simple thing, and that is the formation of a government that will be doing 3 things only. Nothing that challenges the US position, nothing that scares the Iranian regime and allies, and so on. Simply by accepting the fact that forming a government at minimum, with absolutely no political figures in that, responsible for 3 things. The first 2 will have exceptional powers from Parliament, because once again, it doesn't threaten anybody. The first one would be something massive on infrastructure, like, if we are very ambitious, we would say dealing with the electricity issue. If we are less ambitious, we would take, for instance, waste management. Number 2 point would be definitely on the social nets, either with dealing with poverty, or by extending social security to everybody, or at least health coverage. And the number 3 point will be dealing with the central bank, restructuring, and 2 tasks that it will have to do, whether it likes it or not. The first is to put some order in the banking system, and potentially also reduce the number of currency rates. And putting some order in the banking system doesn't, it's not so difficult. I mean, can we imagine that a year after everything collapsed, we still didn't start doing at least the asset quality review of the banks to be able to determine which banks will be viable and under which circumstances? And the last point that it will have to do, together with the government, is to re-engage with the IMF. Not necessarily, of course, for this government itself to be able to put a program together, but at least to start taking into consideration what the prerequisites are and to implement them as quickly as possible. Now, to force these people in the system to act, there are ways, the carrot is not enough. Telling them that this would be good for the country is certainly not enough. These people are, most of them, extremely corrupt. They don't care about the country and they don't care about the people. And we have to keep that in mind. They care about themselves, which means power, pocket, but also legal actions. And here there is a stick needed. And we've seen the debate over sanctions. Do sanctions work or don't they work? Do we need political sanctions or corruption-motivated sanctions? Whatever. But sticks exist. We don't need necessarily to go to sanctions. And I personally, from my small capacity, gave this system 3 sticks at least. The first one is that when I spent about 10 years in the administration, many people ask me, why did I stay for long? Well, because simply we finished reconstructing the financial accounts of Lebanon in 2018 at the end of the year. And that is an amazing stick that can be used, because without that, there wouldn't have been the possibility of any audit. Now the audit is possible. And now whenever we want, whenever we mean checks and balances, we have the tool in front of us. The number two tool that I very modestly contributed to is to launch the idea of a forensic audit within the government plan. Of course, it was taken too quickly, and the idea was to keep it until the end. It scared the hell of those people in the system, but it is still there, and it is still a tool that can be used. Number three, one thing that we finished in 2019 is to succeed in joining the automatic exchange of tax information program with the OECD and Global Forum. And this in itself created a way to trace and claim the stolen or ill-gotten assets. And this we cannot throw in the bin. This can be extremely useful in the coming month. So we have those 3 sticks plus any sanctions one wants to envisage to make this system accept those first few steps and to make it accept whatever is going to come after that. Now, of course, we are seeing very clearly what the system wanted. When I resigned, and I said why I resigned, I said it publicly. I said because we are torpedoing the IMF program, because we are igniting the pound, doing nothing policy was the policy that the system wanted to implement by shifting the losses from the banking system and the central bank to the population through haircuts, through the depreciation. And soon we will unfortunately see the lirification, and we are going to see attempts to steal public assets, and maybe to put the gold in the same category, because the solutions that were proposed in front, and those were to shift the public assets to the banks and the central bank's balance sheet, would have not only taken money from the citizen, but on top of that, it wouldn't have provided any kind of solution, because what we need is fresh dollars from abroad. We don't need to take local assets and shift them somewhere else, let alone that they also wanted to avoid the restructuring of the local debt in order to pretend that losses are smaller. And this, of course, would have taken us to a situation whereby Lebanon would have been in an unsustainable position even after all of the program. And all of this leads to what? It leads to leaving the country in an unsustainable situation, but also to the soaring of inequalities and potentially chaos and lawlessness. And I want to just mention quickly that if the government plan had been implemented by now, the pound would have been stable at around 4,000, and big depositors only would have lost about 35% of their deposits. Nowadays, practically all depositors have lost more than 70%, or at least don't have access to more than 70% of their deposits. So why was this torpedoed? Very easy, but very important to keep in mind, because we're going to have to deal with that if we implement any kind of solution. Well, because most of the banks and the central bank did not want to admit that the losses were here. For the central bank, it's simply a political stance. For the private banks, it's that shareholders don't want to take the loss. They simply want to shift the loss to depositors, and this is what's happening. And these people, thanks to the concentration of power and money that they have, were able to twist the arms of politicians, but also to buy some MPs. We have to admit that, and some media. And when we saw three things at the same time, the political groups that were supposed to support the government turning against the government at parliament, when we saw the government losing faith in its own plan, and when we saw all the mood turning against that, it was obvious that an IMF program would not be easily implementable in a situation like that, and therefore they managed to sabotage it. Now, this doesn't mean that until we reach an agreement, until we are in a positive momentum whereby we have that kind of government I was referring to, and whereby we engage again, there are lots of issues that can be dealt with immediately, or at least whenever there is a structure in place. Again, I just told you how to twist the arms of these people. We have the sticks in hand, and I'm very happy that at least 3 of them were provided by my team. And on the fiscal, for instance, what do we do? Plenty of things. I mean, the debt restructuring in itself will make a huge difference on the fiscal. And this would lead to the restructuring of the central bank and the banking sector. We have to start immediately working on the size of the state. It is not the level of salaries that was the problem. The problem was the number of people that were not needed in the system. And of course, it needs a phasing out, not to be done brutally, especially in those circumstances. The pensions, I will not come back to that, but it's a critical point. The political spending, obviously, the elimination of some public administrations and SOEs. Why do we still have a Ministry of Information? We have plenty of Dr. Goebbels in the system, but we don't need a Ministry of Information anymore. We don't need an SOE for guaranteeing investments. We don't need the Council for the South or the Fund for the Displaced. And we have to redefine the role of CDR. Those cannot be overlapping with existing public administrations. We, of course, need to secure infrastructure and public services, but this has to be done with a very clear list of priorities. The do everything at the same time, the way we used to, has to stop. We know what the priorities are, and we have to focus on them until this is achieved, starting with electricity, telecom, and waste management. Obviously, we also need to eliminate the black boxes. You know, we keep talking about the problem of electricity in Lebanon. What is EDL's problem? Well, it's only 2 things. The first is that EDL is the biggest black box for the political clans. And the second is the subsidies policy of the government. Apart from that, EDL is just another SOE in the system. And of course, we need to continue the tax reform agenda by shifting the burden on rent income, which has been practically non-taxed, plus try to tax to reduce inequalities. And tax compliance requires also revisiting the totally useless law, which is banking secrecy. Because nowadays, I mean, the situation is not anymore in 1956. Nowadays, this is only meant to cover those who benefit from financial engineering and tax fraud. And finally, there is a great thing to be done on tax. And this, again, I just spoke about. The automatic exchange of information allows us to collect taxes on the income made by residents abroad. This is a huge source of money. This is not taxed at all. Plus, this is something that will bring money from abroad, and that is not related to the situation within Lebanon. So it's really something that we should tackle immediately. And finally, on subsidies, it's difficult to believe that the country continues to behave the way we are on subsidies. First, there is a huge question. The problem is not only that it is depleting our reserves. The problem is that we don't even know what the reserves are. That is the problem. This is where auditing is necessary. This is where we can see that corruption is all over. And then, if those subsidies were not about accommodating the smugglers, well, they would have probably not existed anymore. I mean, we have petrol, we have pharmaceuticals, and we have wheat. Wheat is a small figure. It doesn't really make a difference. Pharmaceuticals, the market is adapting in itself. Nowadays, what remains is all about petrol, and it is about smugglers. And it's very easy to imagine that the only serious reason behind is that we have someone or something or people who want to accommodate those who are in control of the borders. And we are witnessing across the board an elite that is threatened, ready to give anything for support, on top of keeping, its ill-gotten assets and power. And to be able to deal with that, we need two things at the same time. We need internal pressure. We need the Lebanese to remain mobilized, and we need international pressure. And the idea of simply having a government at any cost, because we need to try to advance on a few things, in my personal opinion, is a very bad idea. What we need now is to take advantage of the weakness of the system to try to enter a new system. Otherwise, if we continue to do things at minima, we will continue to have the same system forever. So, small initiative to wrap it up, a small initiative with new figures, doing only few things to show that the government is still able to perform, to show that the population, if they vote well, can bring into the public system people who can serve them properly, and in order not to tie the Lebanese situation to the regional one.
Thank you. Thank you, Alain. It was a good overview, and I would particularly focus as well on these enforcement mechanisms that you might have mentioned as part of getting the reforms that Nasir spoke at length about to fruition at the end of the day. And if we were to talk slightly more tactical, and I want to go to you, Haneen, for the last 15 minutes to discuss, more tactical issues in the immediate term, right? So a lot of these reforms we have been aware of. A lot of them are critical at this stage, subsidies being a big part of them. There was a piece by the Lebanese International Finance Executives on exactly that, and highlighting the structure of the subsidies and the path forward that I recommend checking out for those interested further in that. But Haneen, I want to go further to you. While we wait for these reforms to happen, while we wait for a government to be in place, people are losing wealth, they're losing income if they still have income, and they're becoming poorer by the second effectively. So technically speaking, on the ground, from an immediate social policy programming perspective, what do you see the next steps are to really be able to preserve and shield whatever is left of the human capital in the weeks, not even months at this stage, really, in the weeks ahead?
Thank you, Chris. So yeah, indeed. But let me first say that with everything that's been said by Nasir and Alain, which I totally agree with, essentially, Lebanon needs a new social contract, something that is really, in a way, different from how it was funding, delivering, cooperating with private sector in terms of delivery of social services. So now that, of course, is a more of a medium term, but there are beginnings of that need. In the meantime, I believe, yes, the situation has gotten so dire that unfortunately, we're talking about almost taking a humanitarian approach, one that we normally think, this is for displaced populations and refugees and what have you. But in fact, for Lebanon, this is where it is now, clearly having an expanded but targeted program. And there's a lot that's been said about social safety net and what it is. And here we refer to really essentially a direct support to families, a cash transfer program that goes to families to help alleviate the income constraints, so that they can purchase food, they can purchase non-food items, they can send their kids to school, An education cash transfer is also absolutely critical. And this is what we has been approved in the social safety net program that has been approved by Parliament recently. Essentially, targeting all the extreme poor that at least are estimated as of March of 2020 to be about 150,000 households or 800 and some thousand people. But as I said, the number could be higher. Targeting them with providing them cash transfer on a monthly basis, and then for those who have children that are at risk of dropping out, to also support them with additional means. Now, so this is very important, but it sounds simple, but it isn't, because for these kind of programs to work, you need, as I mentioned, to have some kind of a targeted approach, because you cannot reach the whole population, and neither is that desirable nor is it fiscally feasible. Although there will be a very large part of the population that will be impacted with subsidy removal, but at least we want to protect those that cannot accommodate or cannot adjust by themselves. I mean, everybody is adjusting their consumption behavior with the way prices are going and so on. And there's some adjustment which is fine. I eat less meat, I buy less luxury goods, that's fine. Where we are worried about kind of adjustments where people don't eat basic minimum requirements, or they pull their kids out of school, or they cannot afford the basic health expenditure. So these kind of three items are absolutely key in any social response that needs to come in, helping against income poverty, which of course includes food, being able for education expenses, and also for basic health. Now, to do that, you fundamentally need databases, you need systems. All social protection systems are built on having a way of assessing people, enrolling them and registering them, verifying them, then providing payments, electronic preferably, grievance redress mechanism. This whole delivery chain, as we call it, unfortunately is very weak, and some of it is totally absent in the Lebanese system. We actually had been working with the government for some years to try to put something in place. Something was put in place, but it wasn't enough. Coming into the crisis, Lebanon was not prepared. So a very important part of this program that I mentioned that we are supporting is to develop these systems, and it's very key. I mean, we saw when the Beirut explosion happened, everybody was rushing to find, who do we help? We want to help, including NGOs, including Lebanese Red Cross, including, donors. But nobody, everybody has their own database, or they don't have a database. So it's really, although this is usually a medium-term reform, but this is the time to put it together, start working on unified social registries, as we call it, with all the IT systems, because this stuff now with IT developments around the world, you can really do it all with technology, and you can reach millions of people very efficiently and effectively with these kind of systems. So this is what Lebanon needs now, has a golden opportunity to develop these delivery systems in a transparent way. I know there's a lot of skepticism among the Lebanese that this money will not go to the right place, and it will be served by politicians and the like. Well, we're working very hard on ensuring that this doesn't happen in the program. We have a lot of controls, if you will, conditions, if you want to call them, which are, however, helping to develop this delivery system that I mentioned. Basically to say that this is absolutely critical. Eventually, a new social contract has to be developed. I want to mention just one last thing about job creation, because while the economy is obviously not growing, to the contrary, it's contracting. There's no new jobs being created. But in these kind of difficult times, it's also important to think of ways where you can still support firms to survive. And many countries, whether it be because of the COVID pandemic or other crises, have done that. And this is also, I think, a priority that could be put forward. And you start getting a virtuous circle or cycle from that.
Thank you, Haneen. Very clear. Nasir, if I wanted to go back to you now, let's say an immediate government is formed. What are the 2 or 3 priorities that you would be looking at immediately as a factor for reform that are, that can no longer be deferred effectively? And by extension, if you're the international community, what are the real signs that you would be looking for that something is actually moving in the right direction?
Just really two comments. First, I think we are now in the presence of a failed state in Lebanon. I'm not very optimistic that you're going to be able to form a new government. It's not in the interests of the current politicians who are there. Nobody wants to take responsibility for the collapse, the financial and economic collapse. So forming a new government is not going to be easy. What you need is, I think, foreign intervention. It is a humanitarian case, but I think the international community needs to be aware that if truly Lebanon truly becomes a failed state, then what you're talking about is mass migration out of Lebanon. That's partially happening right now. But then also Lebanon can fall into violence, and you'll have a stream of people potentially getting into Europe all over. So I think the stakes are quite high. We need to prevent that. We need an IMF program. That's very clear. We need a macroeconomic stabilization and liquidity program, along with a program that will help rebuild infrastructure. You need to do that. And that's why you need that set of reforms that we mentioned. If you want to go immediately, then you reopen negotiations with the IMF. There's a list of conditionality. I know that many countries will be willing to help Lebanon, even the countries in the Gulf, Europe, potentially the US, China, and others are willing to help Lebanon. Of course, they will want severe conditionality. They'll want an end to corruption and intervention at various levels. And we're all going to butt against the issue of the role of Hezbollah and whether Hezbollah will continue to be a dominant force. I don't know how we're going to be able to resolve that. The only feasible way of thinking of resolving that is if you have new negotiations between the US and Europe on the one side, along with the GCC countries and Iran, whereby you say we need a settlement and we need to keep Lebanon out of that, out of those discussions. And that needs to happen very quickly. If there are delayed negotiations with Iran, that means Lebanon will be kept hostage, as it currently is, and it'll be used as a pawn in the game. We need to avoid that. So that means that the international community, in my view, needs to act very quickly. Perhaps sanctions on the politicians will help. Sanctions must be comprehensive. That is, it must include their assets and deposits and financial and other assets that they have abroad. That is the only language that they seem to understand. It's when you hit them in the pocket that they understand. Otherwise, I'm not so hopeful. The idea that you might have a new government of independent people, experts and all the rest is, I think, a figment of our imagination. The politicians do not want it. They don't want the reforms because they will feel hurt by the reforms. They don't want an audit because they know that the audit will uncover corruption, waste, bribery, cronyism, and all the rest. So the pressure needs to come from outside. And the only pressure they understand is personal level pressure. So I'm not talking about the sort of pressure that comes from any military intervention. Let's be very clear on that. What needs to be put up there is saying the following. We are prepared to organize an international conference for Lebanon, on the agenda will be aid. It will come in part from the international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, particularly for balance of payments support. That can also include GCC countries. For example, you can have swaps currency swaps between central banks in the region that want to help and the Central Bank of Lebanon to provide liquidity that we need. You'll need the capital controls and other to be put in place. But at that international conference, that has to be the carrot, saying that this is what we're prepared to do for Lebanon. And we need to act in concert and at the same time have the stick of saying, this is what's on offer. If you don't do that, then we're prepared to take action. I don't know whether there is courage enough at the international community. I don't know whether the international community sees it as we say it, as we see it, namely the loss of our country. For many of us, certainly for my children and other people's children, they no longer view a future in Lebanon. So this is a time at which we need to rescue Lebanon from being a failed state. The stakes are quite high because you're going to add another failed state to a series of failed states in the region. The other side of it is, yes, you can have a settlement across the region where you're helping countries going all the way from Yemen to Syria, to Iraq, and others, and including Lebanon, in terms of having a new vista moving forward. So I think what I'd like to do optimistically right now is to prepare for that international conference. And then we know exactly what needs to be done. We know what the reforms are. And more importantly, we have the people who are able to enact those reforms. We don't need a bunch of experts to come in and tell us. We know what exactly needs to be done. What we need, however, is to protect those people from the corrupt political class. I don't even actually know how to do that, but I do know that we're going to need international support in order to do that.
This is incredibly clear, Nasir. So thank you for these messages and these recommendations. Unfortunately, our time is coming to an end. So what I'd like to ask you, Alain, Haneen, and Nasir, to do in 30 seconds, please, max each. Can you tell us in 30 seconds, what is the one thing that you're keeping your eyes on in the weeks and months ahead? I would not even say months, but in the weeks ahead, what is the one thing that's on your mind or that you'll be focusing on as we go forward? Maybe, Alain, you can go first. 30 seconds, please.
Well, yeah, in a few words, what I would be keeping my eyes on is precisely the dynamics abroad around what can be done in Lebanon. Once again, there is a captured set of institutions locally, and there is a need for significant pressure from abroad. What remains are the tools to be used. Pushing for a government is not enough. Pushing for any government is not enough. We have to define a few topics on which any structure of power will have to deliver very quickly. And I would also keep my eye on the developments on the sticks that can be used against the system and that the international community is willing to use against the system. Obviously, this can be, as I said, from the set of tools that we already know to specific kinds of sanctions. But all of this will have to be, of course, determined prior to any significant action, because otherwise, I mean, we said it clearly, all of us, this political system doesn't really care about, what we care about. What matters is if we are coming after them, their power, their wealth, and potentially their problems with the legal system.
Perfect, very clear. Thanks. Haneen, in 30 seconds, what are you looking for or at?
So I'm looking to get the safety net system in place because it's absolutely fundamental for all the hopefully structural reforms that need to come in, but even now to help people cope with the situation. People are suffering, and it's the one thing that the international community is willing to do, as evidenced by the World Bank approving this loan of 246 million for safety net without sort of this bigger reform yet, although we have been criticized for that, but it's about saving lives at this point. And so getting it in place and up and running and working is absolutely what I am looking for and hope to achieve.
Thanks, Haneen. Nasir, the final words are yours.
I certainly would wish, as Haneen is saying, we currently have 246 million, but that's really a drop in the ocean, right? I mean, what we really need is something like 1.5 billion really to make a difference. If there's one thing I will be watching, it has to be the geopolitics. it has to be that the US under the Biden administration will want to engage along with the EU and Russia, which is now, of course, a dominant player insofar as Syria is concerned, in order to discuss with the Iranians to have Lebanon outside any discussions and any settlement. Let's remove Lebanon as a pawn. I think the geopolitics is really what it's about. Otherwise, I think we will stay hostage by the parties within Lebanon, wanting to see what an Iranian settlement will look like. And we will suffer in the meantime, and it could drag on. And it'll become a disastrous situation with a breakdown of the health sector, the education sector, trade and tourism, let alone, of course, the destroyed banking and financial sector. So your four pillars of the Lebanese economy will simply no longer be there to sustain you. That's what we need to avoid. And it's about the geopolitics at this moment.
Thank you, Nasir. Thank you, Alain. Thank you, Haneen, for joining us on today's panel. Hopefully we did get to clarify some of the background to the financial meltdown, but also more importantly, the ways forward, as well as the immediate priorities to shield the Lebanese people going forward. So thank you for all those of you who've joined us. Thanks again for the panelists, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.